Hello and welcome to Health Professional Radio. I'm your host, Neil Howard, and I'm glad that you could join us once again. In this segment, we're going to be having a conversation with Dr. Paul Wotton. He's CEO of Obsidian Therapeutics, and he's joining us here on the program to talk about their platform, cytoDRiVE, that regulates protein levels in cell and gene therapies, creating like an operating system for living drugs. Welcome to Health Professional Radio, Dr. Paul Wotton, and thank you so much for taking the time this morning.
It's a pleasure, Neil. Thank you for interviewing me.
Give our listeners a bit of background. Tell us who you are, what it is that you do, and let's talk about Obsidian Therapeutics a bit.
Sure. So I'm originally from the UK. I've been living in the States now for nearly 30 years. And I originally trained in England. I have a PhD from the University of Nottingham. Worked for my first couple of jobs in big pharma companies, American companies, Merck and Abbott. And in 1993, actually took on the responsibility for developing a technology platform that was in its infancy at a company called Penn West, and creating a business plan around that as a platform, which we eventually were able to put onto NASDAQ in 1998. So for most of my career, I've been involved with NASDAQ type companies. I worked for a company that was owned by Warburg Pincus, which I went to in 2000, primarily in business and corporate development, and eventually ended up running a biotech company in Montreal, Canada. So I've traveled a little bit. That was in 2004. I moved back down to the States in 2008 to take over the reins at a publicly traded company called Antares Pharma, which was also a platform where we converted that into a company that was developing its own products. And then I got a really interesting call from a headhunter who was looking for a CEO of a cell therapy company up in Marlborough, Massachusetts. This was in 2014. And I really wasn't looking to move away from Antares because that company was quite successful. But something about the technology platform as a cell therapy company was really intriguing. And because of that, I made a decision to join a company which had fantastic technology, great science, and that the balance sheet needed a bit of fixing, but we managed to do all of that. Focused the company on developing a therapy, which is a cell replacement therapy for the back of the eye. And that company was bought by Astellas. And from there, I was working with Bob Langer, who was on our board at Okata. That was the company that sold to Astellas. And we started up Sigilon in 2016, and I was CEO there. We were developing a platform which is very relevant to today's discussion because it was a way to give cell therapies to the body to act as a little cell factory that would manufacture proteins that people might be missing. And I believe that technology is just about to go into the clinic. And I ran that company for just over 2 years. I did a big transaction with Lilly in type 1 diabetes where you can actually see these cell therapies being very useful. But I stepped down from that one and handed over the reins because my wife was at the time going through chemotherapy, and I decided to take a time out to look after her, and made a commitment that if I ever went back into industry, I would just focus on oncology. And that's eventually what brought me to Obsidian. And Obsidian's a company that is focusing on what I think is the next generation of cell and gene therapies, where you can actually regulate or control their activities in the human body quite simply using a regular drug which you can take by mouth. And the drug we're actually using, in fact, is about 50 or 60 years old. It's a very safe, older drug. And we are able to regulate these cell and gene therapies in the body now, which is the first time it's ever been done. And we're focusing very much on oncology together with our partners at Bristol Myers Squibb. So it's a great way for me right now to employ all of my business instincts and training and use it in a therapeutic area that I really am passionate about.
Well, when you talk about controlling the activity of these cells, traditionally, what was the biggest challenge, I guess, of these cells being out of control? I mean, weren't they developed for a reason, and once they fulfill that purpose, dissipate or go benign?
Yeah, so It's a great question. If you look at the CAR T therapies have really changed the way we look at cancer treatment, and for the better. And they work in about 1/3 of the patients that receive these things as a complete cure effectively, and they work really, really well. But there's a few issues that I think we can improve on. One, of course, is avoiding the cytokine storm, which has been quite well publicized. And we can actually help mitigate that by controlling the cells themselves once they've been given to the body. Because what we can do is regulate their proliferation within the human body, as well as the activity of the cytokines in the human body. So a patient can now be titrated by the doctor in the clinic. And so I think that's really important. The second thing that I think is important, and this is where we really hope to make a difference with a couple of the pipeline projects we're working on, is in actual fact to increase both the persistence of these cell therapies in the body so they can actually last for longer, and just give you a more durable response in diseases like multiple myeloma, for example. And that is important because the approach we're using, which means that you can control cytokine activity in these cells, what we do is program the cells to produce a cytokine that basically enables them to be stronger for longer. And what we can do is employ that technology and not have that cytokine switched on all the time, but just boosted now and again to help those cells proliferate and obviously provide a more durable treatment for patients, which I think is a really good outcome.
Now, this platform is cytoDRiVE, I do understand. Is that the name of the platform that we're discussing?
Yes, it is, yeah.
When do you anticipate full release of this platform into production or into availability for use?
So we are working on some internal programs ourselves, and we also have a partnership with Bristol Myers Squibb. So the BMS partnership is one which is going very, very well. In fact, we're just about to hand over our first candidate to them for them to go through preclinical studies and take it into the clinic. And I expect that we should be seeing this platform going into the clinic within the next 18 to 24 months, either with a BMS program or one of our own internal programs.
Do you anticipate this being an absolute game changer when it comes to these types of genetically engineered cells?
Yes, and I can give you an example of what we're doing in our own platform. So we have developed a pipeline. One of the things that we wanted to do was to develop a pipeline which looked at using different cell types. So we're working with BMS on CAR T cells. For our own pipeline, we have a couple of interesting aspects to that. One is working in an area which is known as tumor-infiltrating lymphocytes, or TILs. And the other programs are looking at natural killer cells where we can engineer those. But the TILs are really super interesting because these are they're known as tumor-infiltrating lymphocytes, and they're your body's own reaction to the presence of a tumor. And your cells actually do go after tumors. That's your immune system's function. And the challenge is that those cells eventually get overwhelmed by the fact that the tumor is growing faster than they can cope with. But what people have been able to do is to isolate lymphocytes from tumor tissue, grow them up in a lab, and then give those cells back to a patient. And they're already targeting the tumor because they know where to find it, and they can recognize those tumor cells in the body. And they give these back to the patients after about 3 or 4 weeks of actually taking the tumor out. And people have seen some tremendous responses already in indications like melanoma. Mm-hmm. And the challenge with those is, first of all, we've got to grow them outside the patient's body in a lab and then give them back to the patient, which does take some time. And the second thing is, when those cells have been given to the patient, they support those cells in the patient's body by using a cytokine known as IL-2. And IL-2 has its own issues associated with it. First of all, it's quite expensive, but secondly, and more importantly, it can create quite serious side effects in those patients that receive it. So you actually limit the number of patients that you can apply this technology to currently. Well, we believe what we can do is to engineer TIL cells to produce their own cytokine, we're actually using something called IL-15. And we can actually provide each of those cells with a little battery pack that we can turn on and off on demand using our acetazolamide drug. And that means now you can control the proliferation and the persistence of those cells without having to rely on an injection of IL-2 being given to a patient on a frequent basis. And so consequently, we can regulate the therapy, titrate the number of cells that are active, and avoid the use of IL-2, which I think is ultimately going to make it more, this type of therapy, much more accessible to patients. And at the end of the day, the most important thing for me is to get this type of approach being used in as many patients as possible with less limitations on its use.
And we'd like to learn more about Obsidian and what you're doing there. Give us a website where we can go and get some more information.
Yes, it's www.obsidiantx.com.
Well, Dr. Wotton, I appreciate you speaking with us during this segment. It's been a pleasure.
It's nice talking with you, Neil, and stay safe.
You do the same. You've been listening to Health Professional Radio. I'm your host, Neil Howard, in conversation with Dr. Paul Wotton, CEO of Obsidian Therapeutics. Audio copies of this program are available at hpr.fm and healthprofessionalradio.com.au. You can also subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. Listen in, download at SoundCloud, and be sure and subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com, Health Professional Radio.